Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're diving headfirst into a really massive piece of legislation, the full text of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act.
Yeah, and when you say massive, you're not kidding.
Right. Now, this isn't a quick read. It's pretty sprawling. It touches almost every corner of American life, from what happens on farms to what might show up in your next tax bill.
Exactly.
So our goal today is to kind of cut through the complexity. We want to pull out the most important bits, the most interesting things, maybe even a few surprising elements without getting totally bogged down in, legislative jargon.
Think of it as your shortcut.
Yeah, exactly. Your shortcut to understanding the key proposals in this act. We're covering agriculture, defense, healthcare, a whole lot more. Okay, let's unpack this.
Absolutely. And what's really striking about this act is just how many different parts of our society it aims to address, all, within a single bill. We're seeing changes to really well-established programs alongside the introduction of completely new ideas. So our mission here is to give you a clear overview of these crucial areas. We'll focus not just on what the Act says, but also start to understand, why these changes might actually be significant in your life.
Okay, let's start with agriculture then. It definitely gets a lot of attention in this bill. Right off the bat, there are adjustments to how Medicaid checks up on its providers.
Right.
And a tightening of the rules for when Medicaid overpayments can be waived, and a push for more frequent checks on who's eligible for Medicaid.
So more scrutiny there.
Seems like it. They're also tweaking how the value of your home affects whether you can get Medicaid for long-term care. And here's a pretty clear line. No federal money for Medicaid and CHIP for people who can't prove their citizenship or nationality.
That's a significant policy point.
So, yeah, it really sounds like a move towards stricter rules around who can receive these benefits.
That's a good way to put it. These Medicaid changes definitely point towards a more rigorous approach, to making sure people are eligible and that payments are correct.
Yeah.
What's interesting, though, is the potential ripple effect. Think about individuals and families who depend on these programs. For example, getting rid of that good faith waiver. That could mean providers face tougher demands to pay back any overpayments, even if they weren't, intentional errors.
Right, even honest mistakes.
Exactly. And the citizenship verification rule might make it harder for some people to access the healthcare they need. It adds another hurdle.
Exactly. And sticking with food and nutrition for a second, there's a rule that's set to expire in October 2030. It currently makes some exceptions about who can live with someone getting help under the Food and Nutrition Act.
Ah, okay. So that might change down the line.
Could do. Plus, there are changes to what are called ABIWD waivers. That's for able-bodied adults without dependents.
Right, the work requirement waivers.
Yeah, and it seems like states will need stronger support, basically from their governor or top executive, when they ask for these waivers.
So it raises the bar, makes it potentially harder to get exceptions to work requirements for food assistance?
Seems that way.
That sunset provision you mentioned, it suggests a future change in how the government views these living arrangements in the context of food assistance. And as for those ABIWD waivers, requiring the state's top official to be on board, that really highlights the political aspect of these safety net programs, doesn't it?
It really does.
It could mean we see pretty different approaches to these waivers depending on who's in charge in each state.
Now, here's a slightly unexpected detail, I thought. The Act also changes how third-party energy assistance payments work with food assistance. And it makes a distinction between households that include elderly or disabled members and those that don't.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, it treats them differently. And get this, there are also restrictions on using food assistance funds for internet expenses.
Wow, internet expenses.
Yeah. It makes you think about what's considered, essential support these days.
Absolutely. That different treatment for energy assistance. It likely acknowledges that households with elderly or disabled members might face greater challenges with utility costs. That makes sense. But the exclusion of internet expenses, that is a bit of a head-scratcher. Especially when you consider how much we rely on the internet for, everything. Job applications, accessing vital information. This could create another hurdle for some people trying to get back on their feet.
Okay, switching gears slightly to more traditional farm policy. The bill updates what are called reference prices for a whole bunch of crops, peanuts, different kinds of peas, lentils, seed, cotton.
Right, the benchmark price.
Exactly. These are basically the prices that trigger government support if market prices drop too low. But these changes don't actually take effect until the 2031 growing season.
Okay, so it's a change looking a bit further down the road.
Yeah.
Exactly. These updated reference prices are really important, though. They form the financial safety net for farmers, influencing how much government support they receive when crop prices fall below a certain level.
Hmm.
The fact that these changes aren't immediate suggests, well, a longer-term shift in how the government intends to support these specific agricultural sectors.
Gotcha. There are also some tweaks to how base acres are allocated to farms. Base acres are kind of like a farm's historical footprint, right? Used to determine eligibility for certain farm programs.
It's a good way to think about it.
And the bill includes a specific definition for acreage planted on the farm to eligible non-covered commodities. Sounds a bit wonky, I know.
It does sound technical.
But it's all about how farmers qualify for government help.
You're right, it is technical, but these adjustments to base acres and how they calculate planted acreage can really affect farmers' decisions. What to grow, whether they're eligible for those important commodity support payments. It's essentially about fine-tuning the machinery of agricultural support.
Right. The sugar program also gets a makeover. The rates at which the government will loan money to sugar producers are changing, for both raw cane and refined beet sugar.
Okay.
And when the Secretary of Agriculture is adjusting sugar allocations, beet sugar processors who already have sugar on hand will get priority.
That could shift things.
Yeah. Plus, the U.S. Trade Representative has a new deadline for reassigning how much raw cane sugar can be imported at lower tariffs. And there's even a study they have to do on whether we need more rules for refined sugar imports.
Wow.
All while defining what exactly the domestic sugar industry means. It sounds like they're really digging into the details of the sugar market here.
They really are. The changes to the sugar program show that delicate balancing act, between supporting domestic sugar production and managing international trade.
For sure.
Giving priority to processors with existing sugar could definitely shift things around in the market. And that study on refined sugar imports, it hints at a possible rethink of trade policies in this area. And you're right, clearly defining the domestic sugar industry is crucial for figuring out who these policies are actually meant to benefit.
Now, here's something that might poke up the ears of poultry farmers. They're setting up a pilot program for poultry insurance.
No.
So if you're a contract grower of broilers or laying hens, you can choose to get insurance based on weather indexes to protect against extreme weather events. And there's specific funding set aside for this.
That's interesting. A new way to manage risk in that industry.
Yeah.
This is actually a pretty significant development for poultry farmers. They can be really vulnerable to things like extreme storms, heat waves.
Right.
Index-based insurance can be helpful because it can provide quicker payouts after a covered event compared to traditional insurance, potentially offering faster financial relief when it's needed most.
Makes sense. And there's more on the funding front. The bill increases the money for programs that help with public access to land for recreation and wildlife habitat, and also the program aimed at wiping out feral swine.
Oh, okay, continued support there.
Yeah. Plus, they're extending the funding for regional authorities like the Delta Regional Authority and the Denali Commission, and even the trust funds for Paya cotton and wool apparel manufacturers, all stretching out to 2029 or 2031.
So it looks like continued support for a whole variety of initiatives.
Pretty much.
These funding extensions and boosts really signal ongoing support for things like conservation, economic development in specific regions, and targeted help for certain agricultural sectors. It shows a commitment to these existing programs and their goals.
All right, let's switch gears now to defense. The act includes money for building new Navy ships, developing and buying missiles, and various military construction projects.
Yeah.
The kind of big-ticket items you often see in defense spending bills.
Standard stuff, relatively speaking.
Yeah, and the Secretary of Defense has to provide some pretty detailed plans on how all this money is going to be spent.
Accountability.
Right. It's all about accountability for these large sums.
Exactly. The defense appropriations are substantial, as you mentioned, and they cover a wide range of military needs. Requiring the Secretary of Defense to submit detailed spending plans really emphasizes the importance of transparency and careful oversight when you're dealing with budgets of this size.
Okay, now back to health care. This has a huge section in the bill. We already touched on Medicaid eligibility, improving citizenship.
Right.
But there's also a change where states will no longer be required to provide medical help during that reasonable opportunity period. When someone is trying to get their paperwork in order.
Okay, so that grace period is changing.
For Medicaid, yes. Although the CHIP program, which helps kids, still has the option to continue providing assistance during that time.
So it creates a bit of a two-tiered system there.
Seems like it.
It does, and that difference between Medicaid and CHIP during that window of opportunity could, unfortunately, lead to gaps in care for adults compared to children in similar situations. It really highlights how policy choices can have direct and sometimes uneven impacts on people's lives.
Yeah, definitely. Here's another interesting healthcare provision. States are now going to have to regularly check the Death Master File.
The what?
The Death Master File. It's basically a database of people who have died. They have to check it to make sure the doctors, pharmacies, and other providers enrolled in Medicaid are still actually alive.
Ah, okay. That sounds like a pretty straightforward way to prevent fraud and incorrect payments.
You'd think so.
That's exactly the idea. Keeping the information about Medicaid providers and suppliers accurate is a basic but crucial part of making sure the program is run correctly and that, taxpayer money is protected.
Remember that good faith waiver we talked about earlier for some Medicaid overpayments?
Yeah, for providers.
Well, that's going away in 2030. So if a provider accidentally gets paid too much, it could become more costly for them to resolve the issue.
Oof. Sounds like the government is taking a harder line on these types of errors.
It does seem that way.
It does, and this again signals a more stringent approach to Medicaid payments. It makes sure providers are really careful with their billing. They'll likely need to be even more meticulous in their practices going forward.
The bill also says that states have to check who's eligible for Medicaid more often, at least in some cases. Plus, there are new rules about needing to have up-to-date address information for everyone enrolled. And they're trying to prevent people from being enrolled in both Medicaid and CHIP managed care at the same time.
Preventing double dipping.
Right. It's all about cleaning up the rolls and making sure the systems are accurate.
More frequent eligibility checks could mean more paperwork for states and potentially some instability for beneficiaries as their eligibility is reviewed more often.
True.
The address requirement and preventing simultaneous enrollments are further steps to make sure the enrollment data is accurate and to prevent any potential misuse of the programs.
Medicaid drug pricing is also getting a closer look. There's going to be a new survey of what pharmacies actually pay to get drugs when they're not selling directly to consumers. It's called the Non-Retail National Average Drug Acquisition Cost.
NADS, right.
Yeah, and this information is going to be made public. Plus, there are new rules for how they conduct surveys of pharmacies. It sounds like they're trying to shed more light on how drug prices are determined behind the scenes.
Transparency in drug pricing is such a huge topic in healthcare. These measures are definitely aimed at giving us a clearer picture of the actual costs of medications.
Yeah.
Making this information public could be really useful for informing policy discussions, maybe helping people make more informed decisions about their healthcare.
And digging deeper into those drug costs. There are new requirements for the contracts between states and the companies that manage Medicaid benefits. Like managed care organizations and pharmacy benefit managers, or PBMs.
Okay, what kind of requirements?
Well, these contracts will have to be really clear about all the different ways money changes hands. Things like discounts and rebates, what they call direct and indirect remuneration.
Trying to follow the money.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And there are some fees that won't be allowed when the federal government is matching state Medicaid funds. These contract changes have to happen within 18 months after the bill becomes law.
So it's a push for more openness in how drug benefits are managed in Medicaid.
Seems like it.
Exactly. The focus on these direct and indirect payments is all about making sure that any discounts and rebates that these managed care companies and PBMs negotiate are actually benefiting the Medicaid program and ultimately the taxpayers.
Right.
By disallowing certain fees, they're trying to prevent hidden costs and encourage more transparent pricing practices.
Now, this next part is, it's really significant and definitely politically sensitive. The bill prohibits federal funds from being used for what it defines as gender transition procedures.
Okay.
This applies through state Medicaid plans, the CHIP program, and health insurance exchanges starting in 2027. And the definition of gender transition procedure is quite specific. It lists various surgeries and hormone therapies.
Wow. That will undoubtedly have a major impact on a lot of people's access to healthcare.
Huge.
You're right. This provision will have a profound impact on transgender individuals' access to essential health care. The explicit ban on federal funding for these procedures raises really complex ethical and legal questions about discrimination and access to necessary medical care. And it's crucial, as you said, to pay attention to the very specific definition of gender transition procedure that the Act provides to understand the full scope of this restriction.
Yeah. And staying on sensitive topics, the bill also puts restrictions on using federal funds to pay entities that perform abortions.
Okay.
And this includes any of their affiliates or successor organizations. It's a 10-year ban that starts from when the bill becomes law, and they have a specific definition of what counts as a prohibited entity.
So this will likely have a wide-ranging effect on healthcare providers, too.
I would imagine so.
This provision clearly reflects the ongoing debates surrounding abortion access and the role of federal funding. The 10-year ban and the broad definition of what constitutes a prohibited entity could have significant, far-reaching consequences for healthcare organizations that provide abortion services and any related entities.
Okay, moving on slightly.
Yeah.
There are also new rules about when states can get waivers for certain tax requirements related to Medicaid providers.
Provider taxes, right.
Yeah. The focus is on whether a tax is generally redistributive within the healthcare system. And the bill lays out specific conditions under which a tax wouldn't be considered redistributive.
So they're trying to ensure fairness in how these provider taxes are structured and used to fund Medicaid.
That seems to be the goal.
These requirements are designed to prevent states from using these Medicaid provider taxes in ways that unfairly burden certain types of providers or that don't genuinely redistribute resources within the healthcare system. It just adds another layer of complexity to how states finance their share of Medicaid costs.
And perhaps one of the most significant and potentially controversial healthcare changes involves new community engagement requirements for certain adults on Medicaid.
Community engagement
Like work requirements.
includes things like work, education, job training, volunteering. There are some exceptions, ways to prove you're participating, hardship exemptions, specific steps if someone isn't meeting the requirements. They even define exactly who these rules apply to and what counts as community engagement activities.
Okay, that's detailed. And importantly, these requirements cannot be waived under existing waiver authorities, like Section 1115 waivers.
Wow, so they're really locking this in.
Seems like it.
Yeah.
This could really change how some people interact with the Medicaid system.
Absolutely. These community engagement requirements represent a pretty big shift in Medicaid policy for certain adult populations. The specifics, what qualifies, how participation is verified, what happens if someone doesn't comply, will be really important in determining how this provision plays out in the real world.
Yeah.
And the fact that these requirements can't be waived underscores how seriously they intend this change to be.
Now, for people who got Medicaid through the Affordable Care Act's expansion, there are some special rules that kick in October 1st, 2028.
Okay.
They won't have to pay premiums anymore.
Oh, okay. Good news for them.
But there will be required cost sharing, and it will be the healthcare provider's responsibility to collect those charges.
So premiums go away, but maybe copays or deductibles increase.
Yeah.
And doctors have to collect it.
That's what it sounds like. So while premiums are gone, there will still be out-of-pocket costs, and doctors and hospitals will be the ones collecting them.
This change for Medicaid expansion individuals suggests a move towards having beneficiaries share more in the cost of their health care, even while eliminating premiums. And the fact that providers will be responsible for collecting these cost-sharing amounts could also have implications for their administrative workload and maybe how they interact with patients about billing.
Yeah, could get awkward. Lastly, on the healthcare front, there will be new requirement to verify the income of people applying for those premium tax credits, the subsidies to help pay for insurance through the health insurance exchanges.
Okay, income verification. Makes sense.
They'll use both the person's word attestation and also check their data against other sources, data matching. And there's money being set aside for the Medicaid Improvement Fund from 2026 through 2033.
So trying to make sure subsidies are accurate and investing in Medicaid improvements?
Yeah, sounds like they're trying to make sure that people getting subsidies really qualify and that there's ongoing investment in the Medicaid system.
Strengthening income verification for those premium tax credits is aimed at reducing errors and making sure that the subsidies are going to those who are actually eligible.
Right.
And the continued funding for the Medicaid Improvement Fund indicates a sustained federal commitment to trying to make the Medicaid program more effective.
Okay, let's pause for just a second there on healthcare and then jump into commerce and technology. The bill includes a $500 million chunk of money for the Department of Commerce. This is to upgrade and secure federal computer systems using things like artificial intelligence and automation.
$500 million, that's significant.
Yeah. And this money will be available all the way until September 30, 2035.
Wow, long timeline.
So, yes, significant investment in modernizing government IT.
It is, and this significant investment really reflects the growing importance of protecting our digital infrastructure And also the potential for AI to help the government operate more efficiently.
Right.
The fact that these funds are available for such a long period acknowledges that these kinds of large-scale tech upgrades are complex and just take time.
And in a sign of the times, the Act includes rules about charging fees or requiring bonds for AI models and systems.
Oh, interesting. Regulating AI.
Starting to, it seems. It says these fees or bonds have to be reasonable based on cost and treat AI similarly to other systems that do comparable things. They even bring in the official definition of artificial intelligence from a 2020 law.
So they're starting to think about how to put guardrails on this rapidly evolving technology.
That look like it?
Exactly. The inclusion of these provisions for AI models and systems really highlights the increasing attention that policymakers are giving to this fast-moving field. The principles reasonableness, cost basis, equal treatment suggest an attempt to encourage innovation while also making sure there's a level playing field and that potential risks are managed.
Okay, moving on to Homeland Security and Immigration. The bill allocates money in 2025 for building more of that border barrier system,
Okay.
for controlling invasive species, and for upgrading the facilities used by Customs and Border Protection at the border.
So it looks like a continuation of some existing priorities in this area.
Yeah, pretty much.
These appropriations definitely reflect ongoing priorities related to securing the border and its infrastructure. The specific allocation of funds gives us an idea of what the key areas of focus are within those broader goals.
The bill also spells out the specific situations under which the Secretary of Homeland Security can allow non-citizens to temporarily enter the U.S. for law enforcement purposes.
Parole authority.
Yeah, it has to be to help the government, their presence has to be necessary, and the usual visa processes have to be insufficient.
So it seems like a very specific and limited authority.
Very.
Yes, these conditions for what's called law enforcement parole are designed to create a clear framework for a specific and limited use of this authority. It tries to balance the need for national security with the need for cooperation in law enforcement matters.
Now, here's something that could affect a lot of people. The Act creates new fees for immigration court proceedings.
Oh boy, what kind of fees?
Fees for applying to become a permanent resident, for asking the court to reopen or reconsider a case, for appealing to a higher immigration board, even for getting a delay, a continuance in your court hearing.
Wow.
And here's the kicker. These fees cannot be waived or reduced.
Cannot be waived at all.
Nope, and the money goes directly to the Treasury as offsetting receipts. There's also a mention of the CBP electronic visa update system account and how it will be funded. But yeah, it looks like the cost of navigating the immigration court system is about to go up for many.
The introduction of these new non-waivable fees for immigration court proceedings will likely add a significant financial burden to individuals trying to navigate the immigration system. That's tough.
Yeah.
The funding for that electronic visa system account shows the ongoing need to invest in the technology used to process visas, though.
True. We also see funding allocated for modernizing the vehicles used by Immigration and Customs Enforcement ICE and for programs aimed at promoting family unity in immigration.
Okay, so some balancing there, perhaps.
Maybe. Plus, under certain specific conditions, people who sponsor unaccompanied children who arrive at the border might be able to get reimbursed for some of those new immigration court fees we just talked about.
Ah, okay. That suggests an attempt to balance enforcement with some support for families and vulnerable children.
Could be.
That's right. The ICE vehicle upgrades reflect the operational needs of immigration enforcement. The provision for reimbursing sponsors of unaccompanied children for those new fees could help offset some of the financial responsibilities they take on. Maybe encourage more people to step forward as sponsors.
Maybe. There are also funds set aside for sending back non-citizens who arrive from neighboring countries' contiguous territory.
Okay.
And for helping states cover the costs of jailing certain non-citizens who have committed crimes. There are specific rules about who qualifies and limits on how much the federal government will pay.
The escape program funding sounds like.
Could be related.
Yep.
And there's an appropriation for providing legal representation to the Department of Homeland Security in deportation proceedings.
So funding for DHS lawyers in immigration court.
Right. It covers various aspects of immigration enforcement and management.
These provisions address different facets of managing immigration, from the actual process of returning individuals arriving from contiguous territories to sharing the costs with states for incarcerating certain non-citizens and ensuring that DHS has the legal support it needs in removal cases.
And finally, in this area, Homeland Security and Immigration. There are new requirements for doing criminal background and gang checks on unaccompanied children who arrive at the border, and on the adults who want to sponsor them. This includes fingerprinting, background checks, data sharing, and there's funding allocated to support these activities.
No, enhanced screening.
Yeah. And there's also funding specifically to help with sending unaccompanied children back to their home country's repatriation. It all points to a greater emphasis on screening and security in these situations.
These enhanced screening measures for unaccompanied minors and their potential sponsors really show a focus on safety and security. The comprehensive background checks and data sharing protocols aim to identify any potential risks and ensure that these vulnerable children are placed in safe environments.
Okay, let's move on to government accountability and regulatory reform. The Act puts in place new requirements that federal agencies have to follow when they issue new rules and regulations.
Okay, trying to rein in the agencies.
Seems like it. This includes doing detailed economic analyses, assessing the potential impact on inflation, and even stating the specific constitutional authority they have to issue the rule.
So, making agencies show their work, basically. More careful and transparent rulemaking.
That sounds like the intention.
That is the intention. These requirements really signal a push for more thorough justification and scrutiny of agency regulations. By focusing on the economic and inflation impacts, as well as the constitutional basis for the rule, they're trying to ensure that regulations are well thought out and legally sound.
The Comptroller General, who heads the Government Accountability Office, GAO,
Right.
gets a new job here.
Yeah.
If Congress asks, they'll have to decide whether a particular agency action counts as a rule or a major rule.
Okay, so GAO becomes an arbiter.
Yeah. And if a rule is deemed major and it increases government revenues, it will now need to get specific approval from Congress through a joint resolution.
Whoa, okay. That's a significant increase in congressional oversight of agency actions that have a big financial impact. The REINS Act concept, essentially.
Sounds like it.
It is. Empowering the Comptroller General to make these classifications adds another layer of oversight to the regulatory process. And requiring congressional approval for major rules that increase revenue represents a notable shift in the balance of power between the executive and legislative branches when it comes to regulatory authority.
And finally, on the regulatory front, the bill designates certain eligible rules that were issued between specific dates.
Okay.
And if Congress doesn't give its thumbs up within 5 years, those rules will automatically expire. Sunset.
So it forces a review of recent regulations and makes sure they have congressional support, or they disappear.
That's the idea.
Exactly. This sunset provision creates a built-in mechanism for Congress to review and potentially terminate regulations that haven't received their explicit approval within that 5-year time frame. It introduces a new element of, well, potential instability and required review into the existing regulatory landscape.
Now, let's dive into energy and natural resources. The Act mandates that the Secretary of the Interior has to hold oil and gas lease sales in a specific list of states: Alaska, Arkansas, Colorado, Montana, North Dakota, Oklahoma, Nevada, Utah, and any other state with available federal land.
A mandate for leasing.
Yes. They have to offer at least half of the nominated eligible parcels for lease, and even hold replacement sales if leases are canceled or if bids are too low. This sounds like a strong push for more oil and gas development on federal lands.
It certainly does. This clear mandate for increased oil and gas lease sales really reflects a policy direction towards expanding domestic energy production on federal lands. The specific targets and the requirement for replacement sales really emphasize the commitment to meeting these leasing goals.
The process for getting permits for oil and gas drilling is also being sped up. There's a 60-day deadline for a complete review of the application.
60 days? That's fast.
Yeah. And once approved, the permit is good for 4 years. Plus, the royalty rates for oil and gas leases that have been reinstated after a lapse are being changed.
So, making it easier and faster to get drilling projects going.
Looks like it.
Streamlining the permitting process is definitely intended to accelerate oil and gas development. However, it also raises questions, about whether this faster timeline might lead to less thorough environmental review and oversight.
Good point.
And the changes to royalty rates for reinstated leases could affect how economically viable those leases are.
Right. The oil and gas leasing program in Alaska's Coastal Plain ANWR gets a validation of its past environmental reviews.
Oh, okay. Controversial.
And any leases that were previously canceled there will be reissued. Plus, there have to be new oil and gas lease sales in the National Petroleum Reserve, Alaska, the NPRA, every 2 years. And there's a system in place for sharing the revenue from those sales.
So Alaska seems like a key focus for oil and gas development under this bill.
Very much so.
These provisions really demonstrate a clear commitment to oil and gas development in Alaska. By validating those past environmental reviews and mandating regular future lease sales, along with the revenue sharing mechanism, they're setting a clear path forward for this type of energy production in the state.
Renewing existing oil and gas leases also gets a more defined process. Includes specific renewal fees and a 10-year term for the renewed lease.
Okay, more certainty there.
Interestingly, though, the Act also aims to speed up the permitting for renewable energy projects on public lands.
Oh, balancing act.
Maybe. It sets deadlines for government agencies to make decisions and allows for environmental reviews to be done in phases. They even defined what counts as renewable energy project and public lands for these purposes.
So it looks like they're trying to balance support for both traditional and renewable energy sources.
Seems that way on the surface.
Exactly. Establishing a clear renewal process for oil and gas leases provides more certainty for the companies holding those leases. The parallel effort to streamline permitting for renewable energy projects on public lands suggests an attempt to encourage the growth of clean energy alongside fossil fuel development. Although, how strictly those deadlines for renewable projects are enforced will be key.
Right. But it's not all about energy development. The Act also includes a prohibition on putting into effect certain resource management plans from the Bureau of Land Management, the BLM,
Where?
in Wyoming and Montana, specifically those related to their Rock Springs and Buffalo field offices and the Miles City field office.
This indicates some potential disagreement between federal land management and local interests in those areas.
Yeah, definitely suggests that.
You're right. These prohibitions on specific BLM resource management plans point to potential conflicts between federal policies for managing public lands and the priorities of state or local stakeholders in those regions. It highlights the ongoing debates about how our public lands should be used and managed.
Okay, rounding out the natural resources section. There's funding allocated for the 250th anniversary of the founding of the U.S.
The semi-quincentennial.
Right, and for the National Garden of American Heroes. The Forest Service gets the green light to enter into longer-term contracts.
Okay.
There's a process outlined for selling off some federal land in Washoe County, Nevada, for economic development and affordable housing, which will require the county to be involved in selecting the land.
Interesting. Affordable housing link there.
Yeah. And there's a specific land exchange involving the BLM and some private landowners in Utah. So it's a real mix of provisions related to land and resources.
It is. And these diverse provisions touch on everything from celebrating our history to managing our forests and addressing local needs like economic development and affordable housing through land policy. That land disposal in Nevada, with its explicit mention of affordable housing, is a good example of how federal land decisions can be used to try and tackle community challenges.
Okay, turning our attention now to the federal workforce. There are changes coming to how average pay is calculated for retirement benefits under both the Civil Service Retirement System, CSRS, and the Federal Employees Retirement System, FERS.
Okay, how's it changing?
For FERS employees who retire in 2027 or later, the period used to calculate their average salary is being extended from the last 3 years of service, the high 3 to the last 5 years. High 5?
Okay. Although there are some exceptions mentioned.
Right. But this could affect the retirement payouts for future federal retirees.
That's right. This change in how FERS average pay is calculated will likely have an impact on the retirement benefits of federal employees retiring after 2026. Extending the averaging period could potentially result in a slightly lower average salary figure, which would then be used to determine their retirement annuity.
And here's a potentially big shift for new federal employees. In certain covered positions, they will have the option to make a one-time, irreversible election to become an at-will employee.
At will, in the federal government.
That's what it says. This could significantly change their job security and the relationship they have with their employing agency.
It could indeed. The option for at-will employment for new federal hires in those specific roles could fundamentally alter the nature of federal employment, potentially reducing job security, changing the dynamics between federal employees and their agencies. And the fact that this election is irreversible is a really important detail to keep in mind.
Definitely. Now, in terms of keeping an eye on things, the Act includes funding for the Inspectors General, the IGs of both the Social Security Administration and the Medicare and Medicaid programs.
The watchdogs.
Exactly. These are the internal watchdogs who conduct audits and investigations to ensure these agencies are operating properly and that taxpayer money is being used appropriately. It's all about accountability.
Exactly. These appropriations really emphasize the ongoing commitment to making sure these major government programs are run with integrity and are financially accountable. Strong oversight is crucial for preventing fraud and abuse and ensuring that public funds are used effectively.
For the Coast Guard and the Merchant Marine, there's a new authorization. It would allow the head of the department the Coast Guard is operating under, usually Homeland Security, to order members of the Selected Reserve to active duty for pre-planned missions that support the active duty Coast Guard.
Okay. More flexibility for using reserves.
Seems like it. There are some conditions, including that the costs have to be included in the budget, and there's some related technical updates to the law and to the reemployment rights of reservists who are called to duty under this new provision.
So it sounds like it's giving the Coast Guard more flexibility in how they can use their reserve forces.
That's the idea.
It does. This new authority provides the Coast Guard with greater flexibility to utilize its selected reserve members for planned operations that support the active component, while the requirement for budgetary inclusion aims to ensure fiscal responsibility and proper planning for these activations.
Okay, finally, in the area of surface transportation, the amount of oil that can be taxed annually to contribute to the Oil Spill Liability Trust Fund is going up starting in 2026.
Okay, more money for oil spill cleanup potential.
And there's a new registration fee being placed on motor vehicles.
A new federal fee on cars.
Yeah. States will be responsible for collecting this fee and sending it to the Federal Highway Administration, although they'll get to keep some of it to cover their administrative costs. And there might be some alternative ways for states to comply.
This could be a new source of funding for federal transportation projects.
Could be.
That's right. The increase in the Oil Spill Liability Trust Fund's contribution limit likely reflects a need to ensure there are sufficient resources available to handle potential future oil spill cleanups. And the new motor vehicle registration fee represents a potential new revenue stream for federal transportation initiatives. The details of how states will collect and remit these fees will be important to watch.
Okay. Now, we've covered a tremendous amount of ground, but believe it or not, we're not quite finished. Part 2 of this massive act is all about additional tax relief for American families and workers.
Ah, the tax part. Always interesting.
Right. And there's some potentially good news here for folks, including no federal income tax on tips you receive.
No tax on tips. Wow.
And no tax on overtime pay. Plus an increased tax deduction for seniors, which will even go up automatically with inflation starting in 2025.
Okay, that could put more money in a lot of people's pockets.
Could definitely help.
These tax relief measures could certainly provide a welcome financial boost for many American workers and retirees. The exclusion of taxes on tips and overtime directly benefits those earning income in those ways, while the enhanced deduction for seniors could help them manage their expenses. And you're right, indexing that deduction for inflation is crucial for making sure its value doesn't decrease over time.
There's also no federal tax on the interest you pay on car loans.
Car loan interest, okay.
An increase in the tax credit that employers can get for providing childcare to their employees.
Okay.
An extension and increase of the tax credit for paid family and medical leave. And a boost to the tax credit for adoptions.
Lots of family-focused credits there.
Yeah. Plus, the Act formally recognizes Indian tribal governments for certain tax purposes. Now, it's important to remember some of these might have income limits or other restrictions, so they won't apply to absolutely everyone.
Good point. Need to read the fine print. But these additional tax provisions really target various aspects of family finances, from car loans to childcare and adoption expenses.
Right.
Extending and enhancing the paid family and medical leave credit could encourage more employers to offer this valuable benefit. And formally recognizing tribal governments for tax purposes is an important step towards greater fairness and self-governance.
Okay, Part 3 of the tax section is about extending certain tax provisions that were about to expire. These are the extenders.
Ah, the usual suspects.
The familiar ones, yeah. Good news for people using ABLE accounts. Those accounts that help individuals with disabilities save money without losing eligibility for benefits. The increased limits on contributions are not only extended, but made permanent.
Permanent extension. That's big for ABLE account users.
Yeah. Also made permanent is the exclusion from income for employer payments of student loans under educational assistance programs. And that will even be adjusted for inflation starting after 2025.
So that student loan benefit is here to stay and won't lose value.
Looks like it. Offers some long-term security for people in these situations.
Absolutely. Making the increased ABLE account contribution limits permanent provides greater long-term financial security for individuals with disabilities and their families. Similarly, the permanent extension of the student loan payment exclusion offers continued relief for those receiving this employer-provided benefit, and adjusting it for inflation ensures its value holds up over time.
Other tax breaks that are being extended in this part include the deduction you can take for contributions to health savings accounts, HSAs,
Okay.
the increased limit on the tax deduction for charitable donations, a special rule for figuring out the earned income tax credit for certain students, and the increased limit on how much in capital losses you can deduct.
So all of these were set to expire, but are now getting a new lease on life.
Yeah.
Extending these popular tax provisions provides continued predictability and potential tax savings for individuals in a variety of circumstances, from those saving for healthcare to those making charitable contributions or dealing with investment losses.
Okay, finally, we get to part 4 of the tax section. This one is focused on trying to make rural America and Main Street grow again through changes to tax policy.
All right, the economic growth part.
Yeah. This includes extending what's called the special depreciation allowance, bonus depreciation for certain business property, although it will gradually decrease over time in a phased-down schedule.
So still encouraging businesses to invest in equipment and facilities, but tapering it off.
Right.
That's right. Continuing the special depreciation allowance can incentivize businesses to invest in capital assets, which can help stimulate economic activity. However, the phased-down schedule indicates that this particular tax benefit will be gradually reduced in the future.
There's also a brand new special depreciation allowance specifically for what they're calling qualified production property.
Okay, what's that?
It includes things like non-residential real estate used in qualified production activities. Construction has to start between January 2025 and January 2029, and it has to be put into use before 2033. This special deduction can even be used when figuring out a company's minimum tax.
Sounds like a targeted incentive for domestic manufacturing or production.
That's what it looks like.
It does. This targeted depreciation allowance for qualified production property appears to be specifically designed to encourage investment in domestic manufacturing and production facilities, offering a significant tax benefit for businesses that meet the criteria.
The Opportunity Zones program.
Yeah?
Remember that. Aims to spur investment in low-income communities.
Yep.
That's being renewed and enhanced. This includes creating a new category called Rural Opportunity Zones, with specific requirements related to actually using tangible property within those rural areas.
Okay, focusing on rural areas within the OZ framework.
Yeah. And there are also new rules about information reporting for businesses operating in these zones, including reports every 10 years on various economic and social indicators within the zones.
So trying to track if they're actually working, making sure these zones are really having a positive impact.
It seems to be the goal.
Exactly. Renewing and enhancing opportunity zones with that specific focus on rural areas is intended to further drive investment and economic development in communities that need it most. Those new reporting requirements are important for tracking whether the program is actually achieving its goals.
Other tax changes in this part. An increase in the dollar limits for immediately deducting the cost of certain business equipment that's Section 179 expensing.
Okay, helping small businesses write off purchases faster.
Right. Getting rid of a recent change to the rules for very small transactions processed by third-party payment networks, the $600 threshold for 1099-Ks.
Oh, repealing that controversial change.
Looks like it. And raising the threshold for when businesses have to send information reports, like 1099s, to the IRS for certain payments they make, back up to $600. And that threshold is also set to go up with inflation in the future.
Okay, so these seem like changes aimed at easing some burdens for small businesses.
They do.
They do. These adjustments can provide more immediate tax relief for small businesses through those increased expensing allowances and potentially reduce some of the paperwork involved in tax compliance, especially with the 1099 changes.
We also see a new rule that says you don't have to pay federal income tax on the interest you receive from certain qualified real estate loans.
Qualified real estate loans. What are those?
Defined as loans secured by rural or agricultural real estate made before 2029.
Okay, targeting rural investment again.
Yeah. The Low-Income Housing Tax Credit, LHTC, is being modified to increase the tax break in certain situations where a minimum percentage of the housing project is financed with tax-exempt bonds.
So trying to boost affordable housing development.
Seems like it. And the threshold for what counts as a small manufacturing business for certain tax purposes is being significantly increased up to $80 million in gross receipts.
Wow, $80 million. That's a pretty big jump. Provides relief to more manufacturers.
Yeah. These provisions look like they're targeting specific sectors to encourage investment and provide relief.
They are. These provisions aim to incentivize investment in rural real estate, support the development of more affordable housing, and provide tax relief to small and medium-sized manufacturing businesses.
The tax credit for investing in clean energy manufacturing is being extended, although it will gradually decrease for facilities that start operating in 2029 and 2030. The rules for the tax credit related to capturing, utilizing, and storing carbon emissions, carbon capture, or CCS, are also being tweaked. Includes a more specific definition of what qualifies as a facility for this credit.
Fine-tuning the energy credits.
Right. And finally, there are changes regarding deductions for certain income that companies get from overseas FDII, foreign-derived intangible income, and GILTI, global intangible low-taxed income, along with measures to prevent companies from avoiding these rules, and an extension of the base erosion minimum tax amount, or BEAT.
Okay, getting into complex international tax stuff there, and clean energy incentives.
Yeah, definitely more complex provisions aimed at international taxation and encouraging clean energy technologies.
Exactly. These energy-related tax provisions continue to incentivize investment in clean energy technologies and carbon capture, while the changes to FDII and GILTI are aimed at addressing concerns about companies shifting profits overseas to avoid U.S. taxes.
Believe it or not, we're still not done with taxes. Subtitle B of this tax section has even more changes.
Wow, this bill is relentless. Okay, what's in Subtitle B?
This part deals with how health reimbursement arrangements, HRAs, work when they're integrated with individual health insurance plans. It introduces new categories called custom health option and individual care expense arrangements, choices, and direct primary care service arrangements.
Okay. New types of health arrangements.
Yeah, there are exceptions to some of the usual rules for group health plans. These new arrangements come with their own specific definitions and limitations.
So it's about giving employers more flexibility in how they offer health benefits, maybe.
That seems to be the idea.
That's right. These provisions are intended to provide more flexibility for employers and how they can help their employees with healthcare costs, especially for those who might be buying their own insurance on the individual market or using direct primary care models. The specific definitions and limitations are really important for understanding exactly how these new arrangements can be used.
Here's an interesting one. The bill now says that certain amounts you pay for physical activity, fitness, and exercise can be treated as if they were medical expenses for tax purposes.
Oh, really? Like gym memberships?
It defines qualified sports and fitness expenses.
Oh.
There are some related reporting requirements, too.
Yeah.
But yeah, this could be a nice little tax break for people who are active.
It could be. And this provision recognizes the link between physical activity and overall health. By allowing these expenses to be treated as medical costs, it could provide a tax benefit for people who are investing in their fitness.
There's also a new rule that lets you contribute to a health savings account, an HSA, even during a grace period following a flexible spending account, an FSA, or an HRA.
Okay, loosening the rules between FSAs and HSAs.
Yeah. And another change allows HSA contributions even if your spouse has a health FSA.
Fixing that spouse FSA issue. These changes seem aimed at making HSAs more accessible and useful.
It seems that way.
They do. These adjustments to the rules surrounding HSAs and FSAs aim to increase their flexibility and provide more opportunities for individuals to save for healthcare expenses with tax advantages.
The above-the-line tax deduction for HSA contributions for families is being increased, although it will gradually decrease if your adjusted gross income is above a certain level. Phase out. And there are also some minor technical corrections being made to the rules around HSAs.
So it looks like they're trying to encourage more people, especially families, to use these accounts.
That's the likely goal. Increasing that deduction for families could make HSAs more attractive, especially for those with higher healthcare costs, while the phase-out based on income tries to target the benefit.
Okay, finally, and this is a pretty significant new initiative. The Act establishes what it calls MAGA accounts.
MAGA accounts, okay.
Matching Accounts for Greatness in America. It's a pilot program for savings.
A pilot program. Who's eligible?
To be eligible, you generally have to have received federal financial aid for higher education under Title IV of the Higher Education Act.
Okay, so targeting students or former students who received federal aid.
Seems like it.
Yeah.
There are limits on how much you can contribute each year, $5,000 annually. And the money can be used for qualified expenses like higher education, certain job training programs, post-secondary credentialing. So savings for education and workforce development.
Yeah. There are rules about rolling over funds, reporting requirements for the account trustees using a Form 5498QA, penalties for putting in too much money, and even a provision for the government to create default accounts in some situations if someone eligible doesn't set one up.
Wow, that's a pretty novel approach to encouraging savings for education and workforce development, a whole new type of account.
It really is.
It is. The introduction of these MAGIA accounts represents a new approach to trying to encourage savings, particularly for education and workforce training, specifically for individuals who have benefited from federal financial aid. The fact that it's a pilot program suggests they'll be testing it out to see how well it works. The specific details, who can participate, how much they can save, what the money can be used for, will be crucial in determining its overall impact.
Well, you've just taken an incredibly deep dive with us into the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. You can hear it is a truly massive piece of legislation.
Understatement of the year.
Right. And we've really only been able to touch on some of the highlights and key provisions within it. There's so much more detail.
That's right. The potential effects of these changes across so many different parts of our society are really significant. And they're likely to be felt by individuals, families, businesses, government programs for many years to come.
Yeah. So as you think about everything we've discussed today, consider this. What single provision from this entire sprawling bill do you think has the potential to create the most significant and/or maybe the most surprising change? And what makes you say that?
That's a great question to ponder. And for those of you whose interest has been sparked by our discussion today, we strongly encourage you, if you're so inclined, to explore the full text of the bill. You can really delve into the details that are most relevant to your own lives and interests.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive into some very, very complex information.
Thanks for listening.
Until our next exploration.